The wedding reception was in full swing, a lavish celebration with golden chandeliers casting a soft glow over the elegantly arranged tables. The sounds of clinking glasses and murmurs of laughter filled the air as guests dressed in their finest attire mingled and chatted in the grand ballroom. At the center of the room, the newlyweds shared a joyful moment, surrounded by friends and family, but amidst the laughter, there was one man who stood apart. Richard, the billionaire CEO, sat alone at a table near the back, his broad shoulders slightly slouched, his eyes scanning the crowd with a mix of disdain and loneliness. Despite being surrounded by the most influential people in the room, Richard was untouched, alone, as if an invisible barrier separated him from the celebration. A waiter passed by, his eyes flicking nervously over Richard before quickly averting his gaze. Richard's gaze, sharp and calculating, never seemed to land on anyone for too long. His wealth, power, and status seemed to have no effect in this moment, where he sat unnoticed and forgotten, the only person at the event who wasn't part of the crowd's camaraderie. "That guy looks like he doesn't belong," a voice whispered from a nearby table. Richard didn't flinch. He had heard the whispers, the subtle remarks made by people who felt entitled to judge. A few more minutes passed, and the laughter continued, but Richard's solitude remained unchanged. He was a man who had built an empire, who had crushed competitors with a mere glance, yet here he was, alone at a wedding, ignored by all those around him. And then, from the corner of the room, a figure caught his eye. Naomi. Naomi, a young black waitress, moved between the tables with ease, her uniform crisp, her expression focused, a slight smile on her face as she navigated the crowd with purpose. Naomi's presence was unnoticed by most, but Richard could not help but observe her. Unlike the others, she didn't seem distracted by the glamour or the money in the room. She moved with quiet confidence, her eyes sharp, and her demeanor calm and composed. As she approached his table, Richard glanced up briefly, his expression indifferent, before returning to the empty glass in front of him. Naomi, with her gentle grace, reached his table. She was the last person he expected to speak to him. Without saying a word, she placed a menu in front of him. He raised his eyes to meet hers for a brief moment, but instead of offering him the usual pleasantries, she leaned slightly toward him and whispered, "Pretend you're with me, or they'll eat you alive." The words hung in the air, cutting through the background noise of the wedding. Richard froze, momentarily taken aback. He had expected the usual service, the polite exchanges that he could brush aside as he had with everyone else. But Naomi's words, though quiet, carried weight. She was not just a waitress, she was someone who had seen beyond the surface, someone who had recognized the loneliness he tried to hide. His eyes widened ever so slightly as he processed her words. The room seemed to pause for a moment, the laughter dimming in the background as the tension in the air shifted. Naomi was no longer just a part of the staff. In that brief exchange, she had become a force in the room, her power unspoken yet undeniable. Richard's mind raced, but for a moment, he was lost for words. Naomi stood there, unwavering, her gaze steady and unwavering, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips as she waited for his response. Richard, the mighty CEO who had spent years building an empire, was now at a loss. Naomi had done what no one else in the room could do. She had disrupted his world, if only for a second. But in that second, everything had changed. In the heart of the bustling wedding, the atmosphere was filled with laughter, the clinking of wine glasses, and the soft hum of an elegant jazz band. Guests in sharp tuxedos and glamorous gowns moved gracefully between tables, exchanging polite words and raising their glasses in celebration. The sound of champagne being poured into crystal flutes added a soft melody to the evening. But amidst the sea of power and prestige, Richard remained a silent observer. The man who was supposed to be the center of attention, the billionaire CEO, was nothing more than a ghost in the room. He was surrounded by people, yet still utterly alone. Naomi, on the other hand, seemed to be everywhere. Her presence, though understated, was undeniable. She moved seamlessly between tables, effortlessly attending to each guest's needs with a calm professionalism that belied her youth. The flicker of a smile here, the light touch of her hand as she refilled a wine glass there, Naomi exuded quiet confidence. It was almost as if she belonged to the room in a way that no one else did. Her movements were deliberate, but her eyes, always observant, never missed a beat. She saw the way Richard sat, isolated from the world, his eyes scanning the crowd with an air of detachment. She saw the uncomfortable shift of his shoulders, the way he adjusted his tie, trying to appear as though he didn't care about the disconnection he was feeling. Naomi had been watching him, silently studying the man who seemed to have everything, yet lacked something most people took for granted: genuine connection. Naomi knew what it was like to be ignored, to be passed over, to be underestimated. As a black woman working in a luxury hotel, she had faced her own share of microaggressions and subtle prejudices. People often looked at her like she didn't belong in places like this, like she was simply part of the background, a fixture of service, meant to be unseen. But Naomi wasn't just another face behind a tray. She had dreams, aspirations, and a deep well of strength that no one seemed to notice. As she approached Richard's table again, this time with the intention of delivering his next course, she noticed the same thing: he was still alone, still disconnected from everything around him. His posture was rigid, his gaze focused somewhere beyond the crowd, but there was a trace of frustration behind his eyes. She paused for a moment, standing just behind his chair, her heart beating a little faster. She could have just placed the dish in front of him and walked away like she had with every other guest. But something in that moment shifted. She had seen how easily the powerful could hide behind their wealth and influence, how they could isolate themselves in a room full of people and yet remain untouched by the world. Richard, for all his wealth, was as human as anyone else. He was vulnerable in ways that no one else saw. Naomi leaned in slightly, just close enough to be heard, and spoke the words that would change everything: "Pretend you're with me, or they'll eat you alive." Richard's eyes flickered toward her, surprised by the directness in her voice, but he didn't say anything. Naomi, however, wasn't waiting for a response. She simply gave him a subtle nod, signaling for him to follow her lead. There was no time for hesitation. Naomi moved through the crowd like a dancer, her movements confident and sure. She didn't look back to see if Richard followed her, but she knew he had no choice. He had to follow, because the game had changed. As Naomi guided Richard through the crowd, she could feel the shift. The guests who had ignored him now took notice. A few people looked at them in confusion, but Naomi didn't flinch. She walked with purpose, her back straight and her head held high. It wasn't just a physical movement, it was an emotional one. Naomi had taken control of a situation that many would have walked away from. And Richard, the billionaire CEO, the man who had it all, was now following her, not because he had to, but because he realized in that moment that he had nothing left but his pride. Naomi had made him see that pride alone wasn't enough to win this game. As they made their way to the center of the room, Naomi could sense the shift in the air. People stopped talking, and the noise of the celebration seemed to fade as they moved through the crowd. All eyes were now on them. Richard could feel the eyes of the room on him, but it wasn't the usual gaze of admiration or respect. This was different. This was the gaze of curiosity, of surprise, and maybe even a little awe. He wasn't the man in charge anymore. Naomi had become the center of attention. The billionaire CEO, who had once dominated rooms without lifting a finger, now found himself in a situation where he was being led, not by power, but by something far more human. Naomi didn't need a title. She didn't need money or status. She had something far more valuable: the ability to change the course of events with a single, quiet statement. Richard, for the first time in the evening, began to realize that the power he thought he wielded was not as invincible as he had believed. The room was still. The buzz of conversation died down as Richard followed Naomi across the ballroom floor. It was a surreal feeling for him. He, the master of business deals, the billionaire CEO of a massive tech empire, now moving in step with someone who was technically beneath him in the eyes of the world. But in this moment, Richard wasn't the powerful CEO. He was just a man, following Naomi's lead, wondering how this had all come to pass. As Naomi guided him, their footsteps were the only sound that filled the void. She didn't glance back to check if he was still there. She didn't need to. Richard knew he had no choice but to keep up. The air around them seemed to thicken with every step. The guests at the wedding turned their heads, their conversations pausing as they watched Naomi and Richard's quiet procession. It was as if the two of them had become the only people in the room. Richard could feel the weight of their gazes, the curiosity and judgment in the air. He had been the one everyone turned to for answers, for leadership, for the power to make things happen. But now, it was Naomi who held the reins. She wasn't saying a word, but her presence was commanding. Naomi stopped at the center of the room, right in front of the guests who had once looked at Richard with admiration. Now, they were all watching her. Naomi didn't speak for a moment, allowing the silence to stretch out and build the tension. She could feel it, the power shift. Richard stood by her side, uncertain of what was happening, but fully aware of his vulnerability. Naomi's calm confidence was a stark contrast to Richard's unease. As the room continued to watch, Naomi turned slightly to Richard. With the faintest smile, she spoke again, her voice clear but not loud, just enough for him to hear. "Now, do you see it?" she asked, the question not just for him, but for the whole room. Richard didn't answer at first. He didn't know what to say. The words Naomi had spoken earlier still lingered in his mind. "Pretend you're with me, or they'll eat you alive." Naomi had seen through his facade, recognized the loneliness beneath his polished exterior, but what she had also done was show him a different kind of power. Not the kind that came from wealth or status, but the power that came from control over the moment, the power to choose how things unfolded. Richard finally cleared his throat, feeling the eyes of the entire room still fixed on him. "I see it," he muttered under his breath, though it was unclear if he was speaking to Naomi or to himself. But Naomi heard him, and she knew that, in that moment, something had shifted. She had broken through the walls he had carefully built around himself. And the best part? He knew it. Naomi didn't need to explain it further. She had done what she came to do. Her point had been made, and now the rest was up to Richard. The guests, who had once been indifferent, were now watching, waiting to see how Richard would respond. Naomi stood tall, her presence undeniable. She was no longer just a waitress. She was the woman who had taken control, who had brought a billionaire to his knees with nothing more than a few words and a steady gaze. Richard stood there, his posture stiff at first, but as he looked around, taking in the way the room had quieted, he felt a shift within himself. The realization hit him he had never been in control of this moment. Not really. Naomi had been the one pulling the strings all along, and in a way, she had just rewritten the rules. The billionaire CEO, the powerful man who thought he could walk into any room and dominate, was now facing the most uncomfortable truth of all. He was not the center of attention anymore. Naomi had taken that title, and in doing so, she had shown him something he couldn't ignore. Naomi didn't need to make a big speech or perform some grand gesture to prove her worth. She had done it with one simple action, leading Richard through the room, forcing him to confront the fact that, for all his power and wealth, he was no better than anyone else. In the space of a few minutes, she had turned the entire event on its head. The room was still, the silence almost deafening as Naomi stood beside Richard at the center of the ballroom. The guests had fallen into an eerie quiet, their eyes now fixed on the duo at the heart of the room. For a few seconds, it felt like time itself had paused. Richard, the powerful billionaire CEO, had been brought into a moment where he was no longer the focus, no longer the one in control. Naomi, the waitress, had flipped the script. Her words, though quiet, had cut through the noise of the evening, shifting the power dynamic in a way no one had expected. Naomi stood there, unbothered by the hushed attention around them. She had already said what needed to be said, and now, she simply waited. Richard's mind raced. He was no stranger to the spotlight, no stranger to the weight of the world's expectations. But in this moment, he realized something he had never fully understood: how easily a person could be invisible, and yet how much power one could possess just by standing firm in their own truth. The realization wasn't immediate. It was slow, like the subtle unraveling of a carefully constructed facade. He wasn't just a CEO. He was a man who had built an empire on the backs of countless people, a man who had spent years avoiding vulnerability. And now, standing there beside Naomi, he felt exposed. For the first time in a long time, Richard was forced to confront his own isolation. The room, full of powerful figures, had become a stage for a much larger play. Naomi was no longer just a waitress in a fancy dress. She was a person of substance, her presence undeniable. Richard had been reduced to a character in the background, a man who once thought he could manipulate any situation to his advantage, now at the mercy of Naomi's silent strength. The tension in the air grew thicker, as Naomi's gaze never wavered. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry, unsure of how to break the silence. The guests were still watching, their expressions a mix of confusion and curiosity. Naomi, however, remained calm, her eyes steady. She knew what this moment meant. She wasn't here to make a scene or to boast. She was here to show Richard, and everyone else in the room, that power wasn't just about money or status. It was about presence. It was about making people see you for who you truly are. And she had done that effortlessly. "Do you feel it now?" Naomi asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried through the stillness of the room. Richard didn't answer immediately. He didn't know what to say. He had always been the one with the answers, always the one who commanded the room. But now, standing next to Naomi, he was speechless. He could feel the weight of the world shift on his shoulders, but in a way that made him feel lighter. For the first time, Richard realized that there were things in life he couldn't control. Naomi had shown him that. She had shown him that sometimes, the power lies in surrendering control, in letting the moment unfold naturally, without the need for domination. Naomi wasn't here to be a servant. She wasn't here to be anyone's subordinate. She was here to take her place in a world that had often overlooked her, to make her mark in a way that would leave everyone questioning the things they thought they knew about power. Richard finally spoke, though his voice was softer than usual. "I see it," he said quietly. Naomi nodded slightly, acknowledging his words, but not in a way that demanded thanks or praise. It wasn't about that. It was about the understanding. The understanding that in this moment, Richard had learned something about power, about humility, and about the way the world often overlooks those who are actually holding the keys to the kingdom. The guests, once skeptical and unsure, began to murmur among themselves. Naomi's quiet victory had shifted the energy in the room. Richard was no longer the center of attention. Naomi had taken that role, and for the first time, the guests were no longer talking about the money, the prestige, or the influence. They were talking about the person who had just rewritten the rules. Naomi's eyes met Richard's one more time. She didn't say another word. The lesson had been learned. The room, once buzzing with the power of the elite, was now a place of reflection, a place where those who thought they had it all were now left questioning everything they thought they knew. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the room shifted in ways no one could have predicted. The subtle tension that had hung in the air moments before was now replaced with an uncomfortable silence. Naomi had done what no one else had dared to do. She had taken the attention from Richard, the billionaire CEO, and placed it squarely on herself. But what happened next was even more significant than anyone could have anticipated. Richard stood there, still processing everything that had just occurred. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. The moment Naomi had whispered to him "pretend you're with me, or they'll eat you alive," had shattered something inside him. His usual bravado, the confident air that accompanied every step he took, had been stripped away, revealing something raw and unprotected. Naomi had made him feel small in a way no business deal ever had. But there was something else happening too, something that Richard wasn't sure he fully understood yet. He was beginning to realize that Naomi hadn't just taken control of the moment. She had rewritten the rules of the game. This wasn't about power in the way he knew it through money, influence, or status. It was a power that transcended those things, a quiet strength that couldn't be bought. As Naomi stood beside him, unwavering and composed, Richard could feel the room's perception of him shift. The guests, the powerful, wealthy people who had been silently watching him from the sidelines, were now looking at him with a new kind of scrutiny. Naomi hadn't just shown him that he was vulnerable, she had shown everyone else that vulnerability could be a kind of strength. The billionaire CEO, who had been the unquestioned leader of every room he walked into, was now the subject of an unspoken challenge. He had been confronted not by an enemy, but by someone who had nothing to prove and everything to offer. Naomi wasn't here for validation or applause. She didn't need to be recognized by the wealthy and powerful people who had dismissed her for so long. She was already holding the power she needed, self-respect. Naomi's gaze met Richard's once more, her expression still calm, still resolute. It wasn't the kind of look that demanded anything. It was a look of acknowledgement, of understanding. Richard was beginning to understand the significance of what had just transpired. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control of the narrative. Naomi had taken the pen from him and written her own story into the fabric of this evening. The guests around them had begun to whisper, their conversation growing louder. Richard could feel their eyes on him, their silent judgment, but this time, it wasn't the kind of judgment that came from envy or admiration. It was the kind of judgment that came from the realization that the power they had all believed to be untouchable could, in fact, be fragile. Naomi didn't need to say a word to make her point. She didn't need to argue or debate. She had done it with one simple action, with a single phrase. She had shown them all that real power wasn't about the wealth in your bank account or the name on your business card. Real power was about knowing who you were, standing firm in that truth, and never allowing anyone to diminish it. As the whispers in the room grew, Richard felt something shift within himself. The discomfort that had initially overwhelmed him began to change into something else, a kind of awe. Naomi hadn't just exposed his vulnerability, she had shown him the strength that came with embracing it. He wasn't sure if he was ready to acknowledge it, but he knew, deep down, that Naomi had given him a lesson he would never forget. For the rest of the night, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. He wasn't the same man who had walked into this room, confident and aloof. Naomi had broken through the walls he had so carefully constructed around himself, and he had no choice but to reckon with the truth she had revealed. And as the night came to a close, Richard found himself thinking about power, not the kind he had always known, but a different kind, one that had been standing right in front of him the entire time, embodied by a woman who had nothing to prove, but everything to offer. As the evening wore on, Richard found himself more and more lost in thought. He couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental had just happened, something that had altered the very fabric of his reality. The power he had always wielded, the influence he had used to control and manipulate, seemed so small now in comparison to the quiet strength Naomi had shown him. As he walked through the ballroom, his mind wandered back to the moment Naomi had spoken to him. Pretend you're with me, or they'll eat you alive. Those words had been the catalyst for a shift he could no longer ignore. Richard had spent his life building an empire, gaining power, and climbing to the top of the business world. He had been taught to believe that power came from money, from status, and from being feared. But Naomi had shown him something different. She had shown him that true power was not about controlling others or using wealth to dominate the room. It was about presence, about the ability to stand firm in who you were, regardless of what anyone else thought. And in that moment, Naomi had not only taken control of the room, but she had also taken control of Richard. The reality of it all began to sink in. He wasn't the only powerful person in the room anymore. Naomi, the waitress, had made him feel what he had never experienced before: vulnerable. He realized that he had spent so much of his life pretending to be someone he wasn't, hiding behind the walls of wealth and success, thinking that those things would protect him. But now, he felt exposed, like the armor he had carefully constructed over the years had been torn away by Naomi's simple words and actions. It wasn't just the guests in the ballroom who had shifted their perception of him. Richard's own perception of himself had been forever altered. For the first time, he wasn't the powerful CEO who controlled every situation. He was just a man, standing next to Naomi, who had the power to change everything. As the night continued, Richard noticed the subtle changes in the way people looked at him, the way they whispered, the way they hesitated before approaching him. It was clear that Naomi had done something that no one else had dared to do. She had knocked him off his pedestal, and in doing so, she had gained something far more valuable than money or status: respect. People were now looking at Naomi in a new light. She was no longer just a waitress, a servant, a part of the background. She had stepped into the spotlight, not with grand gestures, but with quiet dignity. Naomi's power wasn't the kind that came from loud demands or forceful actions. It was the power of self-assurance, of knowing your worth and standing firm in it, regardless of the circumstances. Richard realized that he had been chasing the wrong kind of power his entire life. The wealth, the influence, the boardrooms, they had all been means to an end, a way to prove his worth to the world. But Naomi had shown him that worth didn't need to be proven. It was inherent, built from the inside out. He looked over at her, still standing tall, calm, and composed. Naomi wasn't concerned with the opinions of others. She wasn't interested in climbing any ladders or impressing anyone. She had simply lived her truth, and in doing so, she had changed everything. Richard took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of the lesson she had taught him settling deep in his chest. Power didn't come from money or influence. It came from being true to yourself and being willing to let others see you for who you really were. And in that moment, Richard knew that he had a choice to make. He could continue down the same path, relying on wealth and status to shield him from the world. Or he could take the lessons Naomi had shown him, embrace the vulnerability, and live with a newfound sense of purpose. As the evening drew to a close, Richard felt a sense of clarity he had never experienced before. Naomi had unknowingly given him a gift, a lesson in humility, in strength, and in self-worth. He wasn't sure how this would change him in the long run, but he knew one thing for certain: things had changed. He would never be the same again. As the night began to wind down, Richard found himself standing at the edge of the ballroom, far from the center of attention for the first time in years. The echo of conversations, laughter, and clinking glasses filled the air, but it all seemed distant now. His mind was still spinning from the events of the evening, The moment Naomi had taken control with just a few words, flipping everything on its head, he felt something he had never felt before, a sense of humility that was as unsettling as it was eye-opening. Naomi had exposed him, not in front of the room, but to himself. The wealth, the status, the power he had built over decades suddenly seemed less important. It was as if everything he had worked for had been stripped away, leaving him with the most vulnerable part of himself, the man beneath the armor. He glanced around the room, observing the guests who had once treated him like royalty. Their eyes no longer held the same admiration, the same respect. The shift in the dynamic was palpable. It wasn't just that Naomi had made him feel small, she had made everyone else see him differently. He wasn't just the successful CEO anymore. He wasn't the untouchable mogul. He was simply another person in the room, standing at the crossroads of a new realization. Richard felt the weight of Naomi's presence lingering in the air. She had given him something far more valuable than a business deal or a promotion. She had given him a lesson in self-worth, in humility, in strength. For a moment, he wondered what he could do with this newfound understanding. He had spent so much of his life focused on climbing higher, on becoming more powerful, on accumulating wealth, that he had neglected the most important part of the journey, understanding who he really was, when the world stripped away everything else. Naomi's quiet defiance, her refusal to back down, had shown him the power of being authentic, of standing firm in your beliefs and your own worth. It was a lesson he had never expected to learn from someone like her. And yet, it was the most profound lesson he had ever received. Richard stood there, alone in his thoughts, feeling the pull of a change that he couldn't ignore. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of clarity. His wealth and status had always been his armor, but tonight Naomi had shown him that real strength came from within. It wasn't about the title or the fortune. It was about the ability to stand tall in the face of adversity, to be true to yourself no matter who was watching. Richard realized that his empire, his success, was nothing if it didn't come with respect for others. He had built a name for himself, but Naomi had built a legacy, one rooted in dignity and self-respect. As the guests slowly began to leave, Richard's mind was still turning over what had transpired. He walked across the ballroom, his steps purposeful, but slower now, as if the weight of his own realizations had slowed him down. He spotted Naomi, standing near the door, ready to leave. Her posture was still straight, her expression calm, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet strength that was undeniable. As she saw him approach, she gave him a small nod, her acknowledgement more than enough. He stopped in front of her, unsure of what to say, but knowing that the moment was too important to pass by. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "For what?" Naomi replied, her tone soft but confident. "For showing me what real power is," Richard answered, his words simple but meaningful. Naomi smiled, a quiet, knowing smile, as if she had already understood that this moment would come. She didn't need to say anything else. She had already given him the most important lesson of all. True power comes not from what you have, but from who you are. With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Richard standing there, a man forever changed by the quiet strength of the woman who had shown him a new path to true power. The night ended, but for Richard, it was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life, a chapter where he would no longer be defined by his wealth, but by his ability to embrace humility, authenticity, and the true strength that comes from within. As the night drew to a close, Richard couldn't help but reflect on everything that had transpired. He had walked into the ballroom earlier that evening with the arrogance of someone who had it all: wealth, influence, and the respect of everyone around him. He had thought of himself as untouchable, the kind of man whose every word carried weight, whose every decision shaped the world around him. But in a matter of hours, everything had changed. Naomi, the woman he had dismissed as just a waitress, had not only humbled him but had shown him a completely new perspective on what it meant to be powerful. Her quiet strength, her ability to command attention without raising her voice or demanding it, was something Richard had never encountered before. It was a power that didn't rely on money, on status, or on fear. It was the power of authenticity, of standing tall in one's own truth, regardless of what anyone else thought. Richard had spent so much of his life building an empire, acquiring wealth, and striving to be more powerful than everyone else. But Naomi had shown him that true power wasn't about the things you accumulated. It was about the respect you earned, the way you carried yourself, and the way you treated others. As he stood there, looking out at the nearly empty ballroom, Richard felt something inside him shift. He had spent so much time running after success, trying to fill a void he had never understood. And now, standing at the edge of that void, he realized what he had been missing all along: humility, self-awareness, and the understanding that the greatest leaders are those who can inspire others not with force, but with integrity. The guests had left one by one, their laughter and chatter fading into the night. Richard knew the world would continue turning, and his business would continue to thrive, but he also knew that something deep inside him had changed. He couldn't ignore it. Naomi had done more for him than he could have ever imagined. She had made him see that success was not measured by how many people bowed to you, but by how many lives you touched by being yourself, by being real. Naomi's quiet strength had become a mirror that forced him to look at himself, to question everything he had built his life around. He wasn't sure what he would do with this newfound understanding, but he knew he couldn't go back to the way things had been. He had to be better. As Richard made his way toward the door, he spotted Naomi one last time, standing near the exit, her posture as straight as it had been all evening. She was about to leave, but this time, Richard couldn't let her go without saying something. He walked up to her, his step slow and deliberate, feeling the weight of everything he wanted to say but wasn't sure how. Naomi looked up as he approached, her expression calm and composed. She had already given him everything he needed, but she seemed to sense there was something more. "Naomi," Richard said, his voice soft but steady. "I owe you more than an apology. You've taught me something tonight that I've spent my whole life ignoring." Naomi raised an eyebrow slightly, as if to say, "I know, *." She didn't respond right away, letting him find his own words. "I spent so much time thinking that power was about control, about being the strongest, the most feared. But you've shown me that true strength comes from within, and it's about how you make others feel, not by putting them down, but by lifting them up." Richard paused, his voice catching in his throat as the weight of his own realization settled in. "Thank you for teaching me that." Naomi nodded slightly, her eyes softening, but her face remained neutral. She hadn't done what she did for gratitude or recognition. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. "You're welcome," she replied quietly, her voice still calm, but carrying a quiet power that made Richard feel as if he had just heard something profound. She didn't need to say more. She had already said it all. As Richard watched her turn and walk out of the ballroom, he felt a sense of clarity that he had never experienced before. Naomi had left him with a gift far greater than any business deal or financial success he had ever known. She had given him the understanding that real power comes from humility, from self-awareness, and from treating others with respect. For the first time in his life, Richard understood what it meant to be truly strong. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but one thing was certain: he would never forget the lesson Naomi had taught him that night. And as he stood there, watching her disappear into the night, he knew he was a different man than the one who had walked into that ballroom hours earlier. The next few weeks after the wedding felt different for Richard. The echo of that night, the lessons learned, and the quiet power Naomi had displayed lingered in his mind like a constant hum. He couldn't shake the image of her calm demeanor, her steady gaze, and the way she had changed the course of his life, with one simple, but powerful action. Naomi had become the catalyst for his transformation, a force that had made him confront the man he had been and question who he wanted to be. Despite his initial discomfort, Richard had come to understand that Naomi had done more than humble him. She had liberated him from the chains of pride and arrogance he had wrapped himself in for years. As the weeks passed, Richard began to act differently. He found himself listening more than speaking, taking time to truly hear the people around him, especially those who had always been in the background. The employees he once barely acknowledged, the ones who ran his company, the ones who kept his empire functioning, now had his full attention. For the first time in his life, Richard started to realize that power wasn't about wielding control over others, but about empowering those around you, lifting them up so they could grow. The boardroom, once a place where Richard asserted his dominance, now became a space where he listened more than dictated. He began to open up to his team in ways he never had before, asking for their opinions, taking their ideas seriously, and even admitting when he didn't have all the answers. He wasn't afraid to show vulnerability anymore, and as a result, the people around him began to respect him in ways they never had before. It wasn't just the people in his business that noticed the change. Richard's personal life shifted as well. He began to reconnect with family and friends he had neglected over the years. The walls he had built around himself, those walls of wealth, success, and isolation, began to crumble. He started to realize that there was more to life than business and the pursuit of status. He began to invest time in the relationships that mattered most, and in doing so, he found a new sense of fulfillment. But it wasn't just his actions that had changed. Richard felt different, like the weight of his own identity had shifted. He no longer saw himself as the untouchable CEO, the man who controlled everything around him. Instead, he saw himself as someone who could make a real impact, not just through wealth, but through the kindness and respect he showed others. His life had taken on a new meaning, and it was all because of Naomi. It wasn't just that Naomi had taught him the importance of humility. It was that she had shown him that real power comes from embracing who you truly are, flaws and all, and using that to make a difference in the world. He thought about her often, wondering how she had known exactly what to say, how she had known the lesson he needed to learn. Naomi had never expected anything in return for what she had done. She hadn't demanded gratitude or recognition. She had simply been herself, and in doing so, she had transformed the course of Richard's life. One evening, Richard found himself back at the same hotel where the wedding had taken place. The place no longer felt like a symbol of his success, but rather a reminder of the moment that had changed everything. As he walked through the grand lobby, he saw familiar faces, but this time, he didn't feel the same sense of superiority. He felt at peace, grounded in a way he had never experienced before. He wasn't the man he had been when he entered this world of wealth and power. He was someone new, someone who had learned that true strength came from within, and that real influence came not from the money you had, but from the way you treated others. As Richard walked out of the hotel and into the night, he realized that Naomi's lesson was not just about humility, it was about understanding that the true measure of a person's worth is how they make others feel. Naomi had given him the most valuable lesson of all, and now, it was his turn to carry it forward. He didn't know where his journey would take him next, but one thing was certain, he would never forget the night that changed everything. The night Naomi had turned his world upside down, showing him the true meaning of power, grace, and self-respect. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. In this captivating black story, a billionaire CEO is brought to his knees by a simple yet profound moment with a black waitress. At a lavish wedding, where power and wealth are on full display, the CEO, once the center of attention, is left isolated and ignored. But when a young waitress, Naomi, steps in, her quiet strength and wisdom change everything. This black story explores the transformation of a powerful man who learns the true meaning of power not through money or status, but through humility and self-respect. Naomi's actions, though subtle, have a lasting impact, teaching Richard that real power comes from embracing your true self and treating others with respect. As this black story unfolds, Richard begins to question everything he thought he knew about success and power, leading to a deep personal transformation. Naomi, with her quiet confidence and dignity, shows him the way to true influence, proving that it is not about dominating others, but empowering them. This black story teaches us that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from those we least expect, and that vulnerability, when embraced, can lead to the greatest strength. Richard's journey of self-discovery and change shows how one encounter can shift an entire perspective, and how the actions of one individual can alter the course of another's life. Naomi's quiet strength and the lessons she imparts are a testament to the power of black stories, stories that are often overlooked but hold the key to real change. This black story reminds us all that true success isn't about what we accumulate, but about how we make others feel, and how we use our strength to uplift those around us.